Okay, so before we get to starting sculpting the actual face, I want to show you what's called some of the dynamic topology, what it is and what it does. And we're going to talk more about topology in the next couple of videos, but I want to give you this introduction about why I like cubes for round shapes better than I like spheres for certain things. So let's take a UV sphere, and then I'm also going to take mesh and a cube. And this cube is going to make a better sphere than this cube will, and I'll show you how. Let's add a couple modifiers. So I add a subdivision surface. Let's give it a couple divisions, maybe this about this many. Give it about an equal number. And I'm going to add one more thing to it. It's called a cast modifier. Doesn't do a lot, but you can see it just pushes it out a little bit. Basically, it's projecting a sphere onto it. Let's apply these. So I got two spheres, and they're, roughly equal in many ways. Let's get them a little bit more lined up with each other. And if we look at these, if I shade both of them smooth, shade smooth, shade smooth, and I turn off wireframe, they're pretty indistinguishable from each other. Why would you do one over the other? One comes in as a sphere. Well, let's take a look at what happens when we sculpt these. So if I move into the sculpting tab here, and I've got my two spheres, this one here, as I start to sculpt and move things, you see I run into a problem where it starts to really want to pinch. This one, however, let's hold. D switches over. If you're using the new 293, which I highly recommend, D is the key to switch between them. And you can see I can do this, and I can make any shapes I want, and there's not any pinching. But here, no matter what I do, I'm going to be fighting pinching here, and I'm going to be fighting D, pinching down here. Well, why is that? That's because this one, all of these are quads, and they're fairly equal to each other. And there's I got this one's connected to 3 points, but the rest of these are all connected to 4. Here, however, you see this is where it's collapsing because everything's trying to come into 1 point. We call this a pole, and this makes it really challenging to get good sculpting. So we want these to be evenly distributed. You see this one's got squares that are pretty even in shape and size compared to this one's got long, skinny ones, kind of square ones here, and they get longer and skinnier as they come up to here, and then we get a bunch of triangles. So it's really hard to work with. Now, we can actually do something about this, though, even if we have bad topology to sculpt on, because there's a couple menus that help us with this. So up in here, there's something called Remesh. Now, there's a Dynatopo system, but I actually don't recommend that for this kind of thing. I really like Remesh because I feel like you get a lot more control over it. In here, I can set a voxel size, and I can set Remesh. And what happens if I press Remesh? Well, you can see it's not as clean as the sphere, but it mostly tried to give me fairly evenly sized squares. What this is doing is it's taking the shape, it's doing what's called a voxel sort of projection to it, and then trying to come up with a decent square quad-based topology to work with. And now I'm actually able to carve things out a lot better. Now, I run into another problem of I've only got so much detail. What if I want to add some really fine details? It's going to be a real struggle for me to get that because my resolution's too low. This is where, again, this comes in. If I take this number of voxel size and I lower it, so let's say I take it down to about half and I hit remesh again, it's going to do it when it's lower, it's going to make the distance between these divisions smaller. So now if I take my wireframe and I sculpt, I've got more detail. This is really handy. Not only is it really handy because I can change the resolution, check this out. Let's say I change the shape dramatically. So if I start to pull and I'm starting to sculpt things with my grab, let's make it a lot bigger and let's start pulling things out. And I want to sculpt on this particular feature. So again, we can see it's all stretched out. It won't work properly because this is so pulled out. I need more geometry. Again, remesh to the rescue. It takes the shape into account and it gives me nice clean squares everywhere. This is really helpful when we're working with faces. We want to combine shapes. We want to pull shapes together. This can let us do that. Now, there's actually there's much better ways than going up to this menu. If I hit Shift R on my keyboard, and you know what? Let's go make sure I'm on my hotkey editor so you can all see that. So when I hold down my Shift, I hit Shift and then R, I get this little grid, which is going to show me the size of these squares. So that when I hit Control R, it's going to give me that resolution I was looking for. A couple notes here. If I do something like this, and now we can see its Z direction is like in like a factor of 3, and I go back to sculpting, and I want to work with this, and I hit Shift R. You can see my squares are no longer to draw squares, they're gonna draw these weird rectangles. And that's because I still have this stretching applied. So if I go back to Object and Control A, and I apply that scale, so now my scale is back to 1. Let's get back into sculpt mode, and now I do R again. It gets me back to these nice squares. Really good to work with. This is going to be really handy for like, we can really build in features. I can make horns or ears or pull whatever I want out of it, and I can actually combine shapes together. So let's go into like our edit mode here, and I'm going to say A, and let's add something like this cube. Just put it right there. And you're like, what am I going to do with that? I'll show you. We take it like this, and then I got this face. This is, by the way, if you ever see this, they're called face sets, and it brings a new default object in. It automatically wants it to be a face set. We can always turn it off in the viewport if it's distracting us, which right now I don't need to worry about that. So let's see what happens with this. Control R just combines it. Not only does it put it together, it actually combined it into one thing. So it's a great way of pulling some of these shapes together. Now you're thinking, why don't we just do everything this way? Well, this geometry is really good for sculpting, but to get like the good shapes, like faces, details, we're gonna have to go up really, really high. And something I wanna warn you about is as you're trying to get higher and higher resolution on these things, yes, it's gonna take longer to compute on your computer to work with, because of course it will. It's gotten more complicated as shape, even as it gives you finer detail to work with, but you gotta look out for this vert count going up. Again, I want you to keep your eye on it. There's a reason we are not doing the whole body with this Dynamesh thing. We're just doing the faces. Keep it under 1 million. That can really run out of run you into a lot of trouble. So when we're working this and you ever feel like it's getting a little too high, we can always reduce the resolution back down to something a little bit more reasonable. Control R, and it's gonna like lower that resolution, but usually it's not too bad. Remember, I'm looking at this in flat shaded, and if I look at this as I'm ultimately going to in the final product as a soft shaded view, you know, it's fine. We can get away with a lot of these shapes. So that's what's nice about this. Another tool we can use, especially with this, is called the snake hook, and this lets us actually pull out depending on the strength of this brush. Let's set the strength all the way up, and I'll show you what you can do with it. Like, we can really go with this as a shape, and then same thing, Control R, and it's going to turn it into it. This is a tool that's designed to work with Dynatopo, but like I said, I find Dynatopo is pretty slow on probably most of your computers. Dynatopo is just an extra feature that's going to, as I pull it out, automatically gives me geometry. It's cool. Let's set it to like 1, so it's like really fine. But it's actually going to slow things down, and it's going to add up vertices like crazy. So it tries to do things based on your brush size, and it doesn't take too long for you to really get out of control with this. You see how quickly this is climbing already, and it kind of makes a mess. This is why I like to use Retopo better, like this remesh better, because it's much easier for me to say this is the size. I start with the lowest grid I can get away with. Control R. If it's too low, we'll see we'll start to lose pieces like this. And then as I go, I increase the resolution and I sculpt at that level. I increase the resolution and I sculpt at that level. It's kind of like working with multi-resolution, except for we don't have to build all the geometry ahead of time. Unfortunately, we can't work up and down in layers, but it's great for blocking it ahead and concepting out ideas. So there's some brushes that work with this. Remesh, we're going to actually have to rebuild this later because the remesh version is going to have terrible geometry for in-game or in-film or resolution model or whatever. Can't really be used for much. Maybe for 3D printing, this stuff can be. But we usually only use it to block things in, which is what we do in the next video.